is the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. Rebuilding America together. Now, here's Jeff.
Thank you, Jason. It's hour 2 of the Jeff Santos Show. Welcome to it. We'll be talking to our good friend Mark Taylor-Canfield, talk all about the Pacific Northwest and what is happening there. Some disgusting revelations about freedom of the press here in the United States and across the world, and get into that. And again, the question we have is, people in Seattle, are they paying attention to what's happening in the other Washington, D.C., with all the Mueller information going on, the investigation of Russia and so forth? We'll get into that, though. It is indeed the Jeff Santos Show that you're tuned into. Well, it's always a great time on Tuesdays for us, one of our favorite times of the week, because it's time for us to go to the great city of Seattle, now with an NHL franchise, to speak to a great musician, a great journalist, and a great progressive advocate. He is the only person that has his own music. Not bad for the Renaissance man, Mr. Mark Taylor-Canfield. MTC, how are you this Tuesday, my man?
Good, and thank you, Jason, for playing my music again. It's always much appreciated. I just participated in another great art walk in Seattle, including a great art opening at my friend Steve Gilbert's gallery, featuring another new friend, Caitlin Hubner's amazing oil paintings. And also, Steve Gilbert's photography is quite amazing, including his great rock photos of the band The Ramones. So that's always fun to check out.
Hey, send those along, man, via email, because I have a huge fan of the Ramones. Saw them 3 times, and have in my apartment a great Ramones poster in front of the CBGBs, which unfortunately is no longer there in New York City. So send that along, my man. I'm a huge Ramones fan, and kudos to that photographer.
Well, you know, one of my friends was in a band called the Shemaniacs, which was one of the last bands to play at CBGB's there in New York City. And, yeah, if you come to Seattle, especially for an art walk, we'll definitely go visit Steve at his gallery. He always has a great party. I also want to throw out some creds here for the Institute for Nonprofit News, because it just released its list of the best stories of 2018. And I really want to give a shout-out to all the independent nonprofit news agencies out there, including Democracy Watch News, where I'm executive director, and truthout.org, where I've been writing. And now Greg Palast has also been writing, another one of your great guests. And he's also written an inquiry to Democracy Watch News talking about writing there. So I'm really excited about that, and hoping to have him as a guest on our Democracy Watch News podcast, the Democracy Cast, very soon, because he's a great guy.
Well, we're hoping he's a little under the weather. We spoke to him off the air yesterday, and we're hoping to have Greg on tomorrow night at this time, actually. So
cool.
We'll look forward to getting our good friend Greg Palast. You mentioned Jason, and let's shout out to him and WSMN. Stay tuned for that right after the news, of course, at 8 o'clock Eastern Time.
I checked that out last week, actually. It was cool.
Yeah, he's great at what he does. And stay tuned again, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Let me ask you this, Mark. I am intrigued by all of this stuff going on with Mr. Mueller and the investigation on Trump. Everybody says, Washington, D.C., but there's another Washington. Of course, that's the great state where Seattle is the great city of. Are people actually aware of this? There's a poll out. We just talked to Bernie Porn of Epic MRA, the great pollster there in Michigan. And, the majority of people in the country, by far, over 60%, believe that he's lying. And I presume people in Seattle are part of that. But are they focused, or are they just overwhelmed by the idea that this is ridiculous, and we can't stand it every day. If you put on CNN or MSNBC, that's all you get. But we're disgusted because this is the guy who's the president of the country. How does that, when you talk to people in the music venues and, in supermarkets and all the places that you talk to your, to voters and to citizens in general, what is it like there in the great progressive city like Seattle?
Well, of course, we have our own issues, and I did get a heads up here that the Seattle Times just a few minutes ago actually published an article online about the judge delaying Flynn's sentencing. So people know about what's happening in Washington, D.C., but we do refer to it as, quote, the other Washington, because actually outside of the Beltway, and especially this far west and northwest, and the Pacific Northwest region, we have our own kind of style of politics and our own style of even journalism to some extent. So people are talking about it, but I think you're going to find that a lot of people are kind of sick of it. They're kind of tired. This is when I go out to political meetings, I hear people talking about all sorts of different issues, and there are many protests in the area in Seattle regarding all sorts of different issues. There tends to be a very strong resistance to the Trump regime by most of our public officials here, actually, which are all pretty much Democrats and independents. So that hasn't changed at all. You also hear it from Pramila Jayapal, our progressive congresswoman, and, city council members. The whole gamut of people are speaking out against Trump. But also, I think people also here realize that if we spend all of our time worrying about, one, what's going on in Washington, D.C., and two, what's happening with the Trump investigations, that it really can be distracting from things that are going on in your own neighborhood and in your own part of the country, not to mention, what's happening nationally and what's happening with some of those departments of the government that Trump now heads, and what are the effects of their decisions and what's been going on behind the scenes that nobody is talking about because they're so busy talking about Trump and Russia. I mean, I really worry that is a problem, and that the Democrats really need to pay attention to what's going on in their own party as well as trying to hold, the Republicans accountable. And I'm a little worried that focusing on Russia 24/7 sometimes gives them an out in terms of trying to clean house in their own party and trying to eliminate some of the corruption there. So there you go. Well, I said it. It's controversial, I know, but I said it.
No, it's true. Talking to a great friend, Mark Taylor-Canfield, here on the Jeff Santos Show. Of course, Mark's a great journalist and a musician, and overall the Renaissance man. We should call him that. So let me ask you this. And I don't know if this is the term. First of all, I hear that Jayapal is going to become the progressive co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. If that's indeed the case, she's well deserved, and I'm glad that she's going to have that leadership role. I've seen her a lot in the last few months on some national television. And I think that it is really important that Seattle and the state of Washington, particularly with Ms. Jayapal, of course, replaced the great Mr. McDermott there, the longtime congressman from Seattle. That, she's one of the key players here. I think she's going to share that title with Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, and another great Midwestern state. And I think that it's really important that she and others, really push the Democrats in this way, because you may be aware of this, and our great friend Wendell Potter will be on later this week, usually on Monday nights. The great whistleblower, formerly of Cigna Health, talked about and gave us the information of all of these candidates and Democratic members of Congress who say they're for single-payer health care, and then they take money from all the health insurance companies. They take it from United Healthcare, from Cigna, from Aetna, on and on down the line. And this, to me, as you said, this is what the Democrats have to do. They have to wipe out this corporate element of the Democratic Party and focus on economic issues that can win, to our friend Bernie Porn's point, in places like the Upper Peninsula. You'll not be able to get a lot, all of them, that's for sure. But there are a lot of great people there, too. And, just like there is in Eastern Washington, we all know of the racism that has emanated from Spokane and other parts of the eastern part of the state. But there's some great people there, too. And Democrats have actually had some success in that part of the country, too. Your thoughts on this, Mark, before we get into another issue that really aggravates me, and that is the abuse of journalism throughout the world and in this country. But your thoughts on making sure Democrats, understand how to attract voters and how to basically be truthful and not play it, too cute because they don't want to, not have the money from Wall Street that is, pervasive in the Democratic Party.
Well, that issue right there was a part of the Occupy Wall Street movement when folks like myself tried to bring the part of the platform of the Occupy Wall Street movement into the Democratic Party, especially here in Washington State, and ran into all sorts of roadblocks, bureaucratic, blocking, a lot of crafty kinds of craftsmanship to block those measures. And, it just came down to a couple. One, a state senator, Bob Hasagawa, who's one of my favorite state senators, who's always introducing a state-run bank, in every session. But he just kind of called me aside and said, Mark, I have to tell you this. I really appreciate what you're doing. A lot of us do. The Progressive Caucus gave me a standing ovation when I made my presentation to them during the Democratic Party state convention. But he made it very clear that, a lot of the money was coming from Wall Street. And so therefore I probably wasn't going to get too far with that agenda. And he was right. It wasn't that there weren't sympathetic people in the party. It was just that the party leadership really wasn't going to stand for that. The other thing is I think we should all remember, too, that Washington State, there are parts of Washington State that are very rural. It's not like, Baltimore to New York City where everything is pretty much urban. It's really a lot of scenic wonder here and a lot of rural towns and rural communities who really do need people to reach out to the working class there. They're not really interested in those elitist beltway pundits from the Democratic Party who seem to be more about attacking Trump than actually getting their own act together. And, they can smell a rat when it comes along. So I think, they'll be smart enough to realize whether the Democrats are selling an authentic ticket or not. And I think in this state, we probably have a better chance, actually, because of the takeover of the state Democratic Party by Bernie-crats. We have a much better chance here of actually getting those kinds of candidates who can reach out to the middle class and the poor and the working people and a lot of the people who have just been ignored by the major parties for years. They're ready and they're willing. We just have to reach out to them, that's all. Oh, and by the way, Jeff, this is the breaking story with Michael Flynn is the judge. U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan told, and this is from the Associated Press, told the former Trump aide in a blistering rebuke today that he, quote, arguably you sold your country out. And he said, I'm not hiding my disgust, my disdain for this criminal offense. So that judge is not happy right now.
No, he isn't, and he's a tough dude, and I'm glad that he is monitoring this whole situation, and he knows what it's all about. I really feel that there is some momentum here. I just hope that the Democrats don't lose their way in the forest here. And I'm hopeful that whether it's Bernie or others who are true progressives, there's only a handful of them. There's people like Ms. Gabbard in Hawaii and Elizabeth Warren and a couple of others. But there needs to be more that understand that we can reach out to a lot more people. And a lot more people can vote as opposed to the embarrassing 30, 40, 50% that, come out in off-year elections as well as the presidential cycle. I think it was like 56 here in the last 2016 race before 2018. I want to talk, though, about something that's very, very concerning to me, and I know something that you bring up because you were there when you saw pepper spray journalists during the Occupy and the protest movement of the WTO and so forth. And that is violence against journalists. And, of course, it was highlighted by the whole Khashoggi thing. And that Trump is still dealing with. And that was good to hear, by the way. The Republicans came along with the Democrats, Mike Lee, Bernie Sanders, and others to get a piece of legislation that basically goes against the idea or confirms the idea that Trump won't admit that, was obviously Crown Prince, Mr. Solomon, that ordered the killing. There's no doubt about that, and it's pretty obvious, and it's gruesome to say the least. But yes, I know this is an issue that you're really concerned about, and more and more people have to realize that we're humans, people who are working in media. We have families, we have the same goals that everyone else does. We just have a microphone or a notebook or an iPhone or whatever, and a camera. And I think that this is important. Your thoughts, my man?
Well, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is one of the top organizations in the country studying this issue, along with the international group Reporters Without Borders and Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. All of these groups have been sounding the alarm over the last decade or so about the treatment of journalists around the world. Well, just this week, the Committee to Protect Journalists have released their new census report where they're trying to keep track of how many people have been arrested. And they found hundreds of journalists right now who have been jailed. And what the frightening thing to them is that it does seem like it's becoming a new norm around the world. And Saudi Arabia is no exception, of course. But there are many countries around the world where not only has democracy been suffering, but also freedom of the press, and that tends to go hand in hand. So as of December 1st, 2018, the Committee to Protect Journalists found 251 journalists in jail. And that includes China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, those three countries have imprisoned more journalists than last year, and they've intensified their repression of local journalists. Turkey remains the world's worst jailer for the third year in a row. They have 68 journalists behind bars. So, wow. This is they found that 70% of journalists jailed on anti-state charges and 28 charged with false news. The latter is an increase from 2016. So this idea of fake news is obviously being used actually to throw people in jail now. So the dictator says, or the junta in power says, you've been reporting fake news about the government. This is subversive, and therefore we're going to throw you in jail. So this mantra that Trump keeps putting out there about fake news is very concerning. And as we've talked about before, we know that in the United States, his whole attitude about the press has been basically that they are, quote, the enemy of the people, unquote. And that kind of attitude is very radical. It's not something that you're going to find from somebody who's a center, middle of the road kind of politician. It's somebody who is trying to gain power against the journalists because they're the ones who can hold you accountable. Now, we all know that sometimes the corporate media especially has not done a great job. And even recently, there have been some problems over there at The Guardian and Politico who have published some things that even journalists are starting to question the validity of, especially Glenn Greenwald. He's been very critical lately. But, they're trying. And ever since I think Trump was elected, there's been a new attitude amongst the press in the United States that really, and especially the D.C. press corps, really have to ask the tough questions. They really have to push the envelope now. And before that, I think people were getting a little lazy.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that this has really, inspired Main Street journalism, to do the right thing, particularly led by the print press. I mean, I'm impressed by what the Times and Post have done, particularly the Times. They're not perfect by any means, and they're still corporate. But they have really done some great work, and even Greg Acosta, has been accosted by the right wing and by Trump. We all know they took away his press credential for a while. He had to go to court to get it back. I mean, this is crazy stuff in 2018, and but this is where we are. And that Trump, this dictator kind of world, this is what we have, and this is a really, really sad thing because. Think about, the person who's in college, an undeclared major, and, if you look at how they treat journalists, when you and I were growing up, and a few years on you, but, I remember that, Woodward and Bernstein were heroes, and there have been people
Walter
after
Cronkite.
that.
Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America. Boy, has that changed. And he has a lot to say about this. He had a lot to say about that in his biography, Life of a Reporter, and he was very upfront about the fact that he felt like once the anchor people started making millions of dollars, including himself, that was a sign that journalism was becoming entertainment and no longer was a public service. And I think he's right. I think when you look at corporate media, I'm a journalist, and I'm part of a group, Democracy Watch News, which does a lot of monitoring of the media. And so we have long meetings about, okay, what did the Guardian actually say? And, did they vet their sources? Is this good or bad journalism? And we have to ask ourselves that question a lot of the times, too. And so, okay, there's been a problem in the media, but that doesn't mean that you're a dictator. There are some subtleties to this issue. It doesn't mean that whatever dictator is running the country you happen to be in has the right to call real news fake news just so that he can push a political agenda. And unfortunately, that's what's happening in the United States right now. And by the way, according to CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, over the past 18 months, they've documented or assisted with the cases of at least 7 foreign journalists here in the United States who were held in prolonged detention by U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement. And that's after fleeing threats in their own home countries. So if you think that, wow, I'm going to run to the United States where press freedom is held as the highest, part of the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment, then watch out, because under the current regime, that may not be true. And by the way, the United States is ranked 45th in the world in terms of press freedom by Reporters Without Borders. So we need to do much, much better. And it's the job of every journalist, publisher, editor in the United States to hold themselves accountable and to hold other media accountable and to hold the president accountable for what's been said about the media and about the news. It's really important that we get it right, folks, because this is, the fourth estate, the fifth estate. We are the people out here, the journalists are the people out here who have been given a platform to try to share information with people, so we better get it right. And if you don't, it can really be detrimental not only to your own career, but to the nation as a whole, because sometimes people take stories where folks have made mistakes, and even though the information, like when Dan Rather was reporting about Bush during the election, right? Even if the information is correct, if the sources end up being suspect, you can lose your credibility as a journalist, and no one will listen to the story. So it's really important that all of
exactly
these
right.
news agencies keep themselves honest.
And this is the other part of it, Mark. This is, to me, the big part. And I've seen this, I've witnessed this. When you have, 400 to 1 when right-wing talk radio and people are coming home from work or they're driving to work in the morning, and that is all you hear. The Democrats are evil, liberals are what's the problem with the world, and so on and so forth. And if that is all you're hearing, and you're a low information voter, meaning, you don't pay attention to politics, you go to work, you come home, you play with your kids, you spend time with your significant other, you watch a movie, you watch a baseball game, whatever, and that's what you do. You don't turn on CNN or MSNBC. That's not your game. So if the only time you're listening, getting information, is snippets on the air. And when you have, unlike this show and a handful of others, there is no opposition. So that's what you're getting. And this is also part of the Democrats' problem, because they haven't supported, left-wing or progressive talk radio, over the years. So, these are all things that are so critical. And you dry up the mainstream media and then there's very little places to get objective perspective on big issues that affect everybody, on healthcare, on education. These are all things that people deal with every day at the kitchen table. And, it's journalists that are so important to the society, just as teachers are, just as nurses are. They all go hand in hand. Because, once you start tearing away at people who basically, protect in cases of nurses and doctors, in terms of educating and informing. And, basically the folks who are both teachers and journalists are informing people about what is happening, including the government officials as well, of course. So it all goes hand in hand, Mr. Mark.
Well, bottom line, democracy requires diversity of opinion. So I don't want to hear from just one side of the issue, whatever issue it is or whatever side it is. And when Clear Channel buys up over 800 radio stations around the country, and we have a Federal Communications Commission, mostly headed up by Republicans, even under a Democrat, who kept pushing for corporate media consolidation where you only have 5 or 6 companies owning everything, well, what do you expect? That's the total opposite of diversity. And that's why I'm always trying to, whenever I do workshops or try to, educate people about this issue, I try to explain to them the new wave is you as a consumer have to be proactive and go out there and find the media and to find the truth. You can't just wait for someone to deliver it to you.
Mark Taylor-Canfield, happy holidays, my friend. Have yourself a great one. Happy New Year. We won't talk to you until in January. We're off next week, so all the best, my man, and have a good one.
You too, and check out segments of this show with me and Jeff at my YouTube channel.
Okay,
Have
we'll
a good
do. I
holiday,
want to
Jeff.
thank Jason. The best. I want to thank Jason for producing this broadcast. Stay tuned for fantasy football. My name is Jeff Santos. Have yourself a good one, folks. Right now, it's my time to say I gotta go.
USA Radio News.
Regarding a government shutdown, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the president is doing what he can to reach across the aisle.
We'll have more to say about that, hopefully, a little bit later, about what the president is willing to sign. I might say the administration is extremely flexible on this issue, and were obviously consulted before I sat down with Senator Schumer and Senator Leahy.
Gun Owners of America and its foundation said they will challenge the Trump administration's new ban on bump stocks and seek a court order to block the rule. The DOJ issued a final rule that would ban the device, which allows semi-automatic weapons to be fired much more rapidly.
For USA Radio News, I'm Chris Barnes.
Arizona Governor Doug Ducey appointed Representative Martha McSally to replace outgoing Senator John Kyle in the Senate. Kyle was appointed to the late Senator John McCain's seat in September. The Dow was up 83 points and closed at 23,676. This is USA Radio News. This week marks 1 year since the passage of the Tax Cuts and Job Act, which reduced tax rates for individuals, increased the standard deduction, and cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Gary Cohen served as chief economic advisor to President Trump during the tax debate. He was on CBS this morning and was challenged regarding wages, and he says wages are going up.
I think when you see 3.1% wage growth against 2% inflation, we've got 1.1% real wage growth. For the prior 10 years, before the tax reform was done, we had zero wage growth. So we've had real wage growth in the United States for the last year. You cannot deny that.
Cohen next addresses the debt problem that we face here in America.
I'm not going to sit here and deny that we've got a debt problem. I think we've got a huge debt problem, and I'll be the first to tell you that. But our debt problem is not a revenue problem. As you just said, our revenue is up this year, even with the new tax legislation. We have a spending problem in this country.
But the revenue would have been higher under previous policy.
It may have been higher. You don't know that. You don't know that. You know, the interesting thing is you say the revenue would have been higher. We don't know if the 500 plus companies that went out and gave bonuses to their workers the weeks after the tax plan was enacted, we don't know if those bonuses would have been given. We don't know if some of those pensions would have been funded. We don't know if some of the companies that raised wages right after the tax plan, if they would have been raised or not. So we say it would have been higher. We don't know that.
For USA Radio News, I'm Tim Berg.
It's 8:05. It's 25 degrees.
Supreme Court Briefs, sponsored by the National Legal Center.
Marbury versus Madison, the principle of judicial review. Arguably the most important case ever decided by the U.S. Supreme Court is Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Chief Justice Don Marshall, writing for the court, established the principle that the Supreme Court had the power, indeed the responsibility, to invalidate acts of Congress if they conflicted with the Constitution. Because the court has no army and cannot raise taxes, it has often been called the least dangerous branch. But because it can invalidate the actions of the legislative and executive branches of government, the Supreme Court is also considered first among equals. History now recalls Marshall as the great Chief Justice. His landmark opinion in the Marbury case, establishing the principle of judicial review, is largely the reason why.
Supreme Court Briefs is brought to you by the National Legal Center as a public service.
Preserving history, honoring excellence, connecting generations. At the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. Connect with Cooperstown at baseballhall.org.